I'd like to shift now to Kamau Franklin, lawyer, journalist, and community organizer. One of his latest endeavors is simply and pointedly called Ungovernable. Last week, he sat down with us to discuss what it means and what it takes to be ungovernable, the importance of building as we fight, and what we can and need to do now. Take a look.
It's important to do short-term protests, short-term action, short-term civil disobedience, and more, because we need to create space to show that there's going to be an active resistance. And I think everybody recognizes this, that there's going to be an active resistance against the policies and measures that this particular administration is going to put in. But we don't just want to fall back into a pattern of, oh, if the Democrats win again, then everything's fine. So we know that in order to use this time period wisely, that we have to build alternative structures that give people ways in which we can start thinking about how do we create alternative food sources, right? How do we create even alternative ways to defend ourselves, people have been talking about. How do we create alternative parties that really represent our values and views? And there's a litany of other things.
And with that, what you said about building alternative parties as well, it seems clear that Ungovernable and other organizations are not expecting the Democrats to be the saviors here. Talk about this idea of the left needing to divorce itself from the Democratic Party in order to really not only affect change, but mount a legitimate opposition to the entire system as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Democratic Party operates to keep the left in the liberal party system, right? So I think it tries to scare us around how far the right wing can go, but it doesn't really offer us any alternative that's different or so different that we think is going to change our lives. I think it's a strategy to suggest that, you may run people on a Democratic Party ticket every now and then because that's what people recognize, until we do the hard work of changing people's minds and saying, well, look, we've tried that route, and maybe there's some different routes that we can take. I think there's some parties out there that are options for people to look at, but I also think some of the conversations that at least we're having is that people are thinking about creating new vehicles that they think are not necessarily interested strictly in every 4 years running someone for president, but are really interested in some of that grassroots organizing that gets candidates to come out of that process that they can run, particularly on local levels, and then maybe work your way up to something bigger. But we definitely think that local level political action is something that needs to be done that's teamed up with the national apparatus.
So with that, also talk about either you personally or Ungovernable. Do you see sort of this idea of working within the system, either, like you said, perhaps sometimes running somebody on a Democratic ticket as a real progressive, or do you see that the focus really needs to shift from trying to work within the system and just focus on building these communities? Is it a little bit of both?
I think there's a clear shift away from the parties, but I think that takes time. I think just because we're there, we haven't brought over enough people to say, like, yes, we agree completely with that. I think the strategy that the left sometimes, one step too far, if we don't bring anybody with us, then we're alone talking to each other. So we have to build a base of people. And I think that's one of the critiques that, and I think rightfully so, some people I know who've done a lot of work, particularly in the South, around issues of civil rights and human rights, was that folks who spent a lot of time critiquing Hillary, and I agree that she needed to be critiqued, were not prepared for the alternative onslaught because they themselves did not do the groundwork necessary to prepare people for battling or for organizing in a different way.
Talk about how left organizations need to focus more on this community building aspect that they just sort of use as lip service while still working inside the system to the extent that they are so easily appeased.
No, I mean, I think you've hit the nail on the head. One of the problems with the left is that this nonprofit structure, this nonprofit industrial complex, as people call it, has really taken over left organizing. Whereas people would organize around many issues, right? Now we've siloed ourselves, one. Two, we've become so dependent on a fundraising apparatus that goes to donors, that goes to foundations. And the foundations then set the agenda for what it is that we're allowed to talk about and not talk about. And even for those who think that they're pretty left, when they do demonstrations and activities against the Trump administration, they couch it within a certain language, which makes liberal types or progressive types comfortable. And again, I believe you have to bring people over, but I also believe that you can only do that by making people a little uncomfortable and making them think about the positions that they have. And that's always the challenge, is that the Democrats and these liberal organizations, their real goal is to hold America together as is, except for them to be in charge. And this incremental thinking around change is what they're comfortable with. If we don't break away from that, and we only look at that as the way in which we will fight, and we will always be left in this position of having left forces co-opted.
Yeah, and it's that idea of an ungovernable, like assumes that you're not going to ask permission, you're not going to ask the corrupt to be less corrupt, because what is the
Exactly.
actual point of that? And with that idea of being uncomfortable, talk about how people can then be ungovernable in their daily lives, and what do we need to change, and what do we need to be comfortable with being uncomfortable? Like, how do we need to get comfortable being uncomfortable, and is that a necessary part of this ungovernable path?
It's a necessary part. It's the hard part. It's the part that takes real organizing and activism and folks who are willing to struggle together. I think one of our problems on the left is that we're ready to split in 2 seconds when we have different ideological views about something that probably doesn't matter except for another 20 years down the line. So I think one of the things that we have to do is sit in a room with each other and start planning and organizing. And it's not that hard these days. I think, again, the liberal apparatus has co-opted even things around sustainable food development, right? So now you can do sustainable food. I think back at the Panthers and the free breakfast programs, the political nature of it, right? It wasn't just about free breakfast. It was a way to reach people, to talk to people around what the system did not provide and could not provide and was not willing to, I should not say could not provide, but was not willing to provide. Once the system got a hold of that, they took the politics out of it and gave some version of it, right? But they took the politics out of it, which made it safe. I think organizing within a community to do cop watches is something that people talk about. It may not, these become model programs that we can sort of think about how we can expand them in the future. But these days, you don't even have to buy cameras. You have cell phones, right? So we can think about how do we organize those things? How do we develop alternative ways to raise money and to get income coming in? Whether or not that's money that's coming in because people are paying dues to organizations and we're trying to sustain off of that, whether or not there's small business enterprises that we think about in terms of sustainable development. I think those are things that are easier to do and that we can do in small collectives and grow those small collectives. I think people are looking for those alternatives, and unless we start to develop them, they're going to lose hope in what the left can provide.
And with that, also talk about what you think is the ideal like structure for this. There's been some talk about using a hierarchy that's similar to what the system uses is not going to work because the system is based on this sort of oppressor versus the oppressed versus the sort of flat structure. What do you think is best when people go to this community building?
Yeah. I think a collective structure is best. One that people have an opportunity to have a voice, one that people have an opportunity to say yay or nay. I do think you try to make sure that you bring as many people along as possible. And then people get assignments. The best leaders to me are people who follow until it's their time to lead.
So finally, talk about what's next for Ungovernable. I know that you did a lot of actions across the nation for January 20th. What are you planning now?
I think we're going to continue with some action. So we just finished discussing doing something on May 1st. And so we're going to put out some information on that as another day in which we can collectively work to put out a strong message of resistance to what's happening. I think we're going to continue to participate in local actions and large actions as they happen. I think as a lot of people are doing. But I think what we're really going to do is start to shift. And what we have done is start to have these conversations around what alternative institutions look like. So via the summer, we're going to have a larger gathering of folks to come together and really share information and start planning around what that looks like.
For more on Ungovernable and to take the pledge to be ungovernable, visit ungovernable2017.com.